Hello again, everybody. John D. Healy here. Back to you with my podcast. It's called It's Good to Talk. People know me because I produced this book about my good friend Stoney McGurn, and that's how it all started. Okay, the book goes from 1941 up until recently. So I'm also sponsored by Liffey Van Lines, a moving company here in New York City, and they have been around for almost 50 years. I have two guests today talking about historical events. Brian Leyden has been on before, speaking about the Sheemore Ambush. Philllip Irwin is from Glenamoy, where I was born myself, and he's going to talk about a battle that took place there 100 years ago, almost to the day, mid-September 1922. Philip and myself have something in common. We both went to the same school in Glenamoy. It was built in 1895 by my grandfather, Patrick Healy, and he was a stonemason. The stonework was so good, it was never plastered. Philip and myself and my neighbours and friends, I was a member of community council, and we converted to a community hall centre in the late 70s, and the same stonework is there. He also built the Corrick musical bridge. So if you're in Mayo, reach out to Philip Irwin for a welcome to Glenamoy. People are friendly and the place is scenic, and you can get a pint of Guinness. Brian Leyden and Philip Irwin, we're here today, back again, talking about history, because the past is important. Brian, I'll start with you. I'll come to Philip in a minute. Brian, the last time I had you on, you were working on a project called the Sheemore Ambush. Can you give us an update on the Sheemore Ambush?
Yes, that was part of the, there's a decade of commemorations. We're talking about the, first of all, the War of Independence, and then it tapering into the Civil War. So actually, the Sheemore Ambush dates back to the War of Independence. So you go 1921. It's March, it's Easter, and it's County Leitrim. And there's a very famous hill there where this ambush took place. It was a significant ambush for kind of the forces, the Irish Republican forces at the time, who were completely united against one opponent, which was the occupying power, British Crown forces in Ireland. And that was a very highly successful ambush in terms of their sort of making their presence felt and causing maximum disruption. So what happened there was I got the historic research, and I'm a full-time writer, so the historic research was given to me, and then I created a script as though you were listening almost to a documentary audio of the actual people all involved. And then Edwina McGuckin directed and filmed a lot of beautiful imagery from the Sheemore area to locate where the ambush happened. And all of that is available actually on YouTube now. Just put in the Sheemore Ambush and you'll get the full story there. So I won't be giving any spoilers on what happened.
No, absolutely not, because we did a podcast before, Brian. I mean, I did a podcast before, Brian, and we went into a lot of detail in it, and we spoke about the role the local women played in the war at the time. Indeed, women are central to Irish society. I think they're the backbone of Irish society.
Yes, coming them on at that time were highly important, John, and very, very brave. And there was a young early girl involved in that ambush. She was, in her teens at the time, and basically a handkerchief had been dropped at the scene of the ambush. And while it was highly successful, the handkerchief would have been used to lead dogs, would have followed the scent, tracker dogs, would have hunted down the successful ambushers, and they would have been lost their lives. So the Black and Tans would have murdered all around them with their blood up, because they had suffered such serious a blow. So she found and hid the handkerchief on her person and got by the checkpoints and that. So it was as brave an act as the ambush itself, and redeemed the whole day. So that's how important one young woman was in that particular event. And I think maybe Philip will have more to say later.
I'm going to move to Philip now, because the other thing that you brought up there is, like, all of these people were very, very young. They were like 18, 19, 20 years old, and then, Philip, can you explain to us the guys that died at the Battle of Glenamoy in 1922?
Well, you had Thomas Healy, Captain Thomas Healy from Pontoon there, and he was only, I think, 19. Sean Higgins, I think, is about 26. And you had William Joe Gill there from Westmeath. He was in his mid-20s as well. And Private Toss Rall from Leitrim, another young man, and Sergeant Major Edward Crabb, a Dublin man. and then we had Private Pat Bray, a County Meath man. So there was a
very interesting, and maybe Brian or Philip, like they were so dispersed, like from all over, from Galway to Leitrim to Dublin. Like,
yes.
How do they all like communicate back in the day before mobile phones? Or and the other question I have, maybe more for Brian, because I know Brian does a lot of research. Like, where do they get the uniforms, and where do they get the guns and the ammunition, and how do they get so organized?
Well, it's an interesting one. We'll make one point. There was, bicycles were an extraordinary, useful invention at that time. The distances people cycled were extraordinary to carry news and carry messages. But it has to be understood there would have been breakdowns in communication occasionally. For instance, at the outbreak of the what we would call the Civil War, which follows on from the War of Independence, you had the attack on the Four Courts, which really triggers the commencement of hostilities between the pro-treaty people, who are known as the Free State and were seen as the elected and official government of Ireland, and then you had the anti-treaty forces, who were the Republican movement, as they would have been known, and remnants of the old IRA, and people who had fought together then split into those two sides. So you had an assassination in England of a General Wilson, and this puts Ireland under the cosh. The British cosh said they're going to intervene unless these anti-treaty forces, something's done. There's an attack on the Four Courts, and actually shortly afterwards, here in Sligo, Donegal border, there's an attack on Finner Camp in Bundoran, which is held by Republicans. The sentry there is unaware that hostilities has broken out in Dublin. Yes. And he gets killed, and they get taken on the hop by that. So there was communication at different times. There was also, remember, at the start of the 1916 uprising, there was O'Neill who sort of sent counter orders to the rising to say, no, call it off, we're insufficiently armed, guns have been intercepted and all of that. And it would be his son who's killed in another ambush taking place, commemorated this week as well, or on the 20th of September thereabouts, which is the death of the Noble Six on Ben Bulben in Sligo. So there was miscommunication, though, as you say, there was extraordinary communication across the country between sides as well. And on the guns point, it might be said that, goodness, here were the two sides on edge, and the country was never more full of guns than it had been immediately after a war of independence. So actually triggering a civil war at a time when everyone's got a gun under the bed is, you have to.
Sounds like New York City today. Anybody can get it.
Yeah.
And then
sorry, Philip, you wanted to say there.
Yeah, the other thing, Brian, that I suppose from someone that's not too up to speed with my history is like a lot of Irish men, I don't know if the women, fought on the British side in World War One, and then when that ended, then the roles reversed. Like the Black and Tans, am I right in saying some of those guys had fought in World War One, and they weren't nice guys at all. They were thugs, really and truly.
Well, yes, there's an awful lot going on in the mix here. In this first portion of sort of Ireland's road to what it is today, so you have you do have a war of independence. Remember, this is coinciding. It's been stewing since 1916 and the uprising. Okay. This is coinciding with Britain being embroiled and its forces taken quite a hammering in the First World War,
right,
14 to 18. So you have soldiers returning, and they would be what we would call veterans, almost like Vietnam veterans or veterans of Afghanistan. They're suffering from wasn't recognized at the time, but it's post-traumatic stress.
Indeed.
They're hardened by battle, and they're coming up against what are essentially untrained farmers and locals and that, who turned out to be quite a good army, because they used these flying columns, which we'll come to again, I'm sure, when we're talking about the ambush. That was that tactic was used, a small force opposed to a larger force. They're more mobile fleet, and they keep on the move, and it's really a large part of how Ireland wins the battle for the War of Independence. And
I'll come back to the Battle of Glenamoy now, because that makes sense from what Philip is explaining about, say, I guess there was 6 died in the Battle of Glenamoy. So if what you're trying to, maybe you're explaining it very well to me, is these would have been like units of 6 and at different locations. Is that right?
Well, I won't speak for the Battle of Glenamoy, but certainly these would be small, self-contained units who kept their information to themselves, had a raft of safe houses, often run by women, and there's talk in Mayo how decent and good the people were. Even what's different in the Civil War is that even though there might have been a strong what we call Free State support in certain parts of Mayo, the locals would still not betray the anti-treaty forces and would still feed them and mind them, because they thought they didn't want to see men who had fought together side by side, shoulder to shoulder.
That's the sad. Well, war is sad anyways. Every war is a sad war.
Yeah.
As I say, love and war, easy to start and hard to end. There's no such thing as a happy war. Look at what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, that's tragedy in the world we live in. But come back to Philip again in Glenamoy. So where precisely, Philip, did this event take place? I know it's near your own place. Explain that.
It is.
Myself.
Well, Glenamoy is about 15 miles from Belmullet, and maybe similar to Ballycastle, to be on the North Coast Road. So at the time, I think the Republicans had taken Ballina about 4 days earlier. So they were heading west, and they headed for Glenasra, which there was a lodge there, an old English lodge there at the time. So they had camped up there for the night, and I think they had an ambush there with some of the Free Staters in Glenasra, but nobody got killed. And I think that they just took their guns and they just released them. And some of them, I suppose, headed for the hills with the news that the Republicans were in Glenasra. And I think with that in mind, the Free Staters then had come through Bangor, and they were coming towards Glenamoy on the 15th. So that it was getting late at night. So I think they broke the lock in the old schoolhouse, and they said they'd camp in there for the night.
Okay.
And so at this stage, the Republicans decided to leave Glenasra, and they were heading for Newport. So they'd have come through Glenamoy and maybe head across the mountains. That was the way they were going to take it. But they came across the old lodge in Gortleithla, and they said they'd camp up there for the night. So with that,
is the village in Glenamoy.
With the village, it'd be only just down the road from their house. There's nothing there at the minute, but there was an old. It was getting a bit derelict at the time, but they took some shelter in there. And with that in mind, two of the Republicans saw a light on in my grandfather's house. So it was about 12 or after 12 o'clock at night. So they decided the chance coming up to see would they get a bit of rest and a bit of food maybe for the night. And when they came to the house, they found that they were in the wrong house. They were in a Free State house. There was two of my uncles were in the Free State Army at the time, and they found 2 men resting up in the bed. So I think they arrested one of them, and the other fella got away, and he went down as far as the schoolhouse and warned the other lads that Irwin's house is full of Republicans, and look at lads, we better go and take them on.
Right.
So that was kind of the beginning of it there at that time. So as it turned out, Michael Kilroy had his men kind of in the lodge, but then this Captain Joe Baker and Tom Ruan, they were the two that came into the house. Tom Ruan had taken, as I say, one of the prisoners with him down to the lodge, but Joe Baker was in the house on his own, and he started to argue with my grandfather about why are you holding up Free State soldiers in your house. And my father tried to tell the outside that
your grandfather, you mean?
my grandfather saying, "Oh, look at there's only Joe Baker in the house here." Shouting out to the lads outside, "Will you come and get him?" And Joe started to get worried. So what he started doing, I think he threw out a hand grenade or two first, and then he started to shoot out the windows in the house. It was an old, long thatched cottage, like at the time, and there had been 3 or 4 windows and he started to shoot out the windows, and it made it look like that the house was full of Republicans.
The tactic he did was he'd go to this window, throw the shots, then go to this window, throw the shots, and go to this window.
He'd run up and down the house.
It made it look like it was more than one.
More than the one, yes, in the house. So he kept that going for some hours, and I know there was retaliation. There was shooting at the house, and I think there was at one stage they were going to throw a hand grenade in, but he had warned them that there was a woman and children in the house, and to keep the firing away from that into the house.
Yeah.
So I'd say in the meantime,
his tactic was clever enough. And Brian, you probably agree that going from one window to another window, because the people down at the roadway, I assume, they wouldn't know how many is there. There could be 4, there could be 5, there could be 6.
Yes. Yeah. So this shooting, I'd say, went on for a while in the night, and there was a lot of shooting around around the village at the time as well, the outskirts as well.
Right.
But coming daylight in the morning, the Republicans had the upper hand. They were in the lodge, and they were in behind them.
Right.
So while Captain Healy and his men were all probably on a ditch or a fence facing the house, and I think they had some prisoners with them that they had taken earlier on in Bangor and in Glenamoy.
Right.
They had taken them as shields, to protect themselves.
Sure.
And but unfortunately, the other Michael Kilroy's men came from behind them, really, and they were nearly shot in the back. They were nearly shot in the head. So they were ambushed from behind. They didn't realise that they didn't
realise what was happening. Yeah.
Yes, where most of the shooting took place that night in the house. In the morning, the other lads had their snipers, I think, ready, and they just picked them off. So it was. That's really what happened on the night here, John.
And that's 100 years ago. My guest today is Philllip Irwin from Glenamoy, speaking about the Battle of Glenamoy 1922. September 16th and 17th commemoration coming up. My other guest is Brian Leyden, speaking about the Sheemore Ambush, which is on video on YouTube. He did a reenactment of that, and you can get that on YouTube as well. Well, those are my 2 guests today. The podcast is called It's Good to Talk, and it is good to talk. So I'll go back to you, Brian, again to explain a little bit more and I'll come back to you in a minute, Philllip, as well, on the Sheemore Ambush, like the dates that Philllip was talking about there, like 1921, 1922. Like, when did things cool off then? And how did they cool down after that?
Well, I suppose just to mention, when we talk about cooling off things had hotted up, let's say.
Right.
Things had hotted up really because of the death of Michael Collins.
Okay.
When we're talking about these two, this period of time,
right?
The 21, the War of Independence, 22, the Civil War,
right,
where we start to fight ourselves. Now, it can be argued that it's a very old sort of colonial weapon. We're celebrating, remember, the partition of India and Pakistan as well. So, what happened in Ireland was revisited there. Basically, divide your enemy by setting them against each other. So, we can say that having successfully or almost successfully executed a war for independence. Remember, Britain was still hanging on as to the terms. They were looking for kind of basically Ireland, which would have a free state, but would still have a lot of allegiances to Britain, and
Right.
so there was the threat that if we didn't get our act together and go for the treaty that had been agreed,
Right.
that the country would be partitioned, which is what we're celebrating this year as well. The partition,
Right.
not celebrating it as such, that's the wrong word, but
Yeah.
we're marking it happening.
Yeah. Okay.
There's too much sadness on every side to use
Indeed.
the word celebrate in that context. But what we're doing really then is seeing that basically there are divisions happening between what was once a united force. Now, there was a division in the country already. Not many people, nor me included, fully realised how in place there was a kind of a unionist, loyalist government ready to rule and govern Northern Ireland. And they had, when you mentioned the First World War, they had kind of they had rolled in behind the British war effort, and in return they were nearly granted that this autonomy. On the Irish side, they would be granted home rule, and that this would actually, if they helped Britain in their war effort. But there was a lot of people said they're never going to keep their promise, and secondly, it doesn't go far enough. But what happened, of course, is that at this stage in the north, they could see that there was basically a militia had armed itself in the
Right.
north. And the IRA had said, well, we'd better get ourselves armed as well.
Yeah, sure.
So now you have two sides going there. So, and you have this tension between north and south. Then, you have a treaty agreed. You have, you have signatories going to London to agree that there's this treaty and how it will be done. And then you have votes in the Irish Parliament, which actually say, yes, let's accept the terms and let's settle for a free state and minus the 6 counties.
Right.
And then you have a walkout by De Valera, who says, no, this won't do. And the next thing, the old core of the IRA, the Republican movement, is occupying certain, often in the one town, a workhouse and a barracks would be occupied by the opposing forces.
Yeah.
So what you have then is a situation that comes to a head when this General Wilson, who had been in charge of the British troops in Ireland, he's executed in London. The British issue an ultimatum: get these Republicans under control or lose your free state, and we'll move back in. And ironically, the heaviest artillery fire on the forecourts that triggered the Civil War was from guns loaned by the British Army to the Free State troops. So the Free State troops then pursue the Republicans, but obviously, seeing as these men fought side by side, they're not particularly interested. And there's several stories, I think Philllip would agree with that man Kilroy, telling prisoners to go home, get fed, they're released, they're not executed, there's no reprisals. But then Collins is shot. We're commemorating, that has just passed at the end of August there, and everyone's blood is up. And suddenly there's retaliations, particularly on the Free State side, and then that's met, of course, measure for measure by the Republican side. And they start shooting prisoners, and people are dying in so-called ambushes, and there's a war for the truth going on as much as for the ground.
Right.
And that's the situation we're in when things are very, very heated up.
Realistically, sad history indeed.
Yeah. You're beginning to see that, in a sense, the Free State side, there's a negotiated end to this, but it's left in a kind of a limbo. But things have turned, in a sense, that the country is left. Perhaps we realised that this thing, it was there, what Philllip was saying there, grandfathers in one house, just the neighbour's house. One man's talking to the other, what on earth are you doing supporting the other side? Brother versus brother, family versus family. In my time, my grandfather and these people wouldn't talk to neighbours over how bitter this dispute was.
Yeah, that's the problem with it. Yeah, it does get bitter. It's from an outside perspective, I can only imagine how difficult it must have been for the recent Good Friday Agreement to be negotiated by everyone involved in both the British side, the Irish side, Martin McGuinness, Gerry Adams, Albert Reynolds, Gareth Fitzgerald. It took years and years and years and years. Yeah. And it would be remiss of me not to mention that the Queen just passed away, and that's the Queen shaking hands with my good friend Martin McGuinness after the Good Friday Agreement. And bear in mind that the IRA, murdered her cousin, I guess, Lord Mountbatten.
Louis Mountbatten.
And yet she and Martin were able to shake hands. And we were remiss me again not to mention that's myself and Martin McGuinness shaking hands again. So you might say I indirectly shook hands with the Queen of England. So
shook the hand that shook the hand.
shook the hand. Yeah, that's a better way to put it, Brian. Shook the hand that shook the hand.
Yeah, well, these and George Mitchell was in there as well, a great statesman, and
absolutely.
There were. I think what you're saying, especially when you mention Queen Elizabeth and Martin McGuinness, and the same would apply to the likes of De Valera and Michael Collins. These are very strong personalities.
Absolutely.
There's human beings behind all of this. And
if you take Kennedy Smith, she was the ambassador to Ireland at the time. Yeah. And the Clintons played a role in as well. And I must give a shout out to another Ballina man, actually, from County Mayo. And that is our president here in America, Joe Biden. He spoke last week to the new Prime Minister of England now, Liz Truss. And we had 2 words for her, well, 3 words actually. And I won't paraphrase them. But he basically told her in simple terms, do not mess with the Good Friday Agreement. Do not change it. Do not switch it. Do not try to dismantle it. Like Boris Johnson, that clown that just left office, he was willing to dismantle the Good Friday Agreement and say, oh, the north of Ireland belongs to the UK. No, the north of Ireland is a part of the island of Ireland. And when it's decided by everyone on the island that we should have a united Ireland, I hope then it'll be done peacefully and without the arms, without the killing, without the murder. So, Philip, I'll come back to you. You have a big, you have a commemoration coming up, I think, next Saturday. Is it?
Yes, John. At 3:00 on Saturday, we're having at least 4 of the families of the soldiers that got killed here on the day, and we're having a blessing, and we're just unveiling a little plaque to commemorate the day, and we're having a lot of people coming, and a few politicians as well, I suppose. And
they're always there. And
they're always there. They like to be seen. So we'll have a few words from them, and there's a few historian coming there from Paddy Flynn from Foxford, and the few people like that have great interest in this war. That's war 100 years,
When I came here to New York in 1976, 77, and there was a gentleman from Sligo. His name was Fred Crystal. He was an older gentleman. He was very fond of the drink, and he had a habit of not being able to remember my name, which is very easy, John D. Healy. So when he would walk into the bar, all he could remember was the Battle of Glenamoy, and he would shout at me, "Kill or be killed." That was my nickname. So I got a nickname from the Battle of Glenamoy. Brian, tell us more about your documentary is done. How many minutes is the documentary?
The documentary it's about 20, 25 minutes. It's Sheemore, Sheemore.
Sheemore,
yeah, the Sheemore Ambush. And
I think does Sheemore mean the Fairy Mountain or Fairy Hill?
It does. Okay. The Hill of the Fairies. It's also greatly commemorated in the O'Carlin music, Sheemore, Shebeog, which is a little mountain beside it.
Okay.
That was done a beautiful job.
Tell me a little bit more about. I'm curious about you obviously had to get actors to reenact it.
Yes.
And is there a musical background to it, or?
Yes, there was original music composed and some beautiful music added in there throughout the piece and to conclude the piece. That was part of a decade of commemoration, so there was original music composed for that as well. Right. My end of it was to write the script and essentially make it seem as though when you click on YouTube and pull it up, it'll seem as though we're only 100 years away, but the people are gone, and it'll make it seem as though it's them speaking. I tried to get into the characters because to go back to when you were showing the photos of McGuinness and the Queen and all that, and what we said earlier, it's always about people in the end.
It is, yes.
And I tried to make them real and alive, and as we began
that's why, Brian, and that's why I'm very impressed with what Philip Irwin is doing. With his project with the Battle of Glenamoy, 100 years old this week.
Yes.
And I think it's important for the next generations coming up to realise that something did happen there.
Yes.
That, Glenamoy is a beautiful village and beautiful people. They always have a kind welcome and a kind heart. And I'm sure Philllip will be inviting you down as well for the commemoration. You can have a drink for me. I'm here.
Everyone is welcome, and we're calling down to your local afterwards for some refreshments.
Yeah, sure. Bernie McAndrew will be coordinating us. And let me see if there's anything else I have to add, apart from the fact that anyone that's tuning in, I did a podcast before with Brian Leyden. Tune into that one. It's Good to Talk is the name of the podcast. And there's a whole series of podcasts. I've done about 40 podcasts so far. Each one is a different topic. So they're not all based on history. They're based on real estate here in New York City and New York events and New York music and bands and all of that too. So there's a lot in my podcast. And the book can be bought on Amazon, and it's also on audio, and it's about $20. I will warn some of your listeners, some of my listeners and your listeners now, that it does contain some adult content. So be careful if you're going to mass or going to confessions. You may have to get down on your knee. But Stoney is still alive and well, and that's how you get the book. Have you anything to add, Brian and Philllip, before we go?
Well, I'll just add, and then let Philllip say yes. That's my. Of course, I'm full-time writing here, John, as well, and I've gone into publishing now myself because, as I say, we're taking kind of command of our own destinies now in things, and I'm very delighted to have a new title from our imprint, Lepus Print. This is called My Name Suspended in the Air.
Lepus Print, yes, okay.
And it's another centenary, Leland Bardwell, who was born 100 years ago in February 1922. She used to say, "I'm as old as the state." We've collected up her poems in this beautiful volume just to mark that. And what I like about that is Leland, though she was actually contradictory, she would have actually been big house Protestant,
right,
but never saw herself as that. She was just a put upon mother who tried to hang on to her children and feed them and find her place in the world as a woman and as a poet and as a writer.
Yeah.
And so that's another centenary I was delighted to mark with my other hat on.
I have read 3 of Brian's books in the past. The one I liked best was The Summer of '63. It sounds like it's a book about JFK and the assassination, but it's more. I won't give the book away. There's a lot of subplots in it, and it's a very interesting book called Summer of '63. And the other books were interesting as well. The other book you wrote was The Home Place, which was more personal and
memoir. Grown up in the west of Ireland.
But the 3 books were interesting. So I wish you well with the new self-publishing. That's very good and very important with you. And Philllip, I'll give you the final say here.
I'd just like to thank everyone for helping out with this project. There's so many to thank, and especially the relations. They're great, and they're all keen to come, and they're grateful for what's going on, and that they said they'd be delighted to come. And thanks to the Western people as well, and to Michael D there for promoting me and getting it started with me.
He works with Midwest Radio. He was also on my podcast here. We talked about Gaelic football and hurling and sports and all that, and he's pretty class act, if I may say so myself.
He is, exactly, indeed, John. So we're thankful to everyone and to all my own family here, Mary and the whole lot, for all the work, and Ronan Kelly next door for all the work he's put into as well. So
very good. And looking forward, yourself and Brian should probably sit down and have a chat, and maybe the Battle of Glenamoy could be reenacted somewhere in the future in a similar concept as the Sheemore Ambush. I think that would be brilliant, and I'm sure if we shout around, there would be people willing to sponsor the event and something for the future to look forward to, the reenactments of those 6 young men, because there were young men. Captain Healy, by the way, is no relation of myself. I'm John D. Healy. The relation I would have with Captain Healy is probably courage and drink, maybe. So we'll leave it on that. Good talking to you, Philllip, and good talking to you.